Well, shit. Woo! Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Die Hard MMA podcast. I'm your host, as always, Clint McLean. Today we're going to break down UFC London Fight Night 147. This fight card is headlined by Darren Till and Jorge Masvidal, and holy crap, was last week bad. I got my ass kicked. I'm going 1-7 for minus 4.95 units. Oh, that sucks to say. Record in 2019 is still 28-21 for plus 18.87 units. That is still a phenomenal record. I'm still very proud of that. Now we just need to right the ship and get back on the winning track. So let's go. First things first, we're going to do a slight recap of UFC Witchita because I'll be honest with y'all. I made a couple of errors. We talked about last week how not all the fight cards are going to go your way. You're going to have some variance. We're just looking for 55%, but that doesn't exclude us from learning when we make bad mistakes. That's one of the best things you can do for yourself is go back, figure out where you went wrong, and try and prevent that mistake from happening again. So going through our picks, first and foremost, I apologize. I think Otto was just a bad pick. I thought I saw some value there. The biggest value that I saw in him as an underdog at plus 170 was the ground advantage. I thought when it hit the ground, he was going to be able to take control and really just out-muscle his opponent. The second that they hit the ground, he got a choke thrown on him, and it was over. I completely misread that fight. So the Otto pick, that was a bad pick. I overestimated Otto. Luis Smoka, man, he just did not show up. I think Smoka inside the distance at plus 240 is still a value play, and I'm actually going to look at him in his next fight. I don't think that was him in there. Athletes, some days they just don't show up, and in the cage, it's way worse than on the football field or on the basketball court. When they're in there and they're locked in with a killer, you can really tell that they're having an off night. You cannot have an off night at this level in the game, and I really think Smoka just had a bad night. Marion Renault, we had her inside the distance at plus 350, and boy, if you watched that fight, tell me we didn't have value at plus 350. Oh my gosh, Yana Kunitskaya's face had been caved in. Her nose was broken. She had blood dripping out of her mouth in the middle of the fight. And if Renault had just put her on the ground, if she had just dumped her and started pounding or even sunk in a choke, it would have been over. Her corner was yelling for her to go for the takedown, change levels, put her on her back, and she just wanted to box and stay at range and try and win a decision. It was just bad. I mean, I really think if you played her straight, you still should have won that fight. I think Renault won that fight. It was close, though. It wasn't so bad that I could call it a robbery. Fair game. We lost that one, but that was a solid pick in my opinion. I stand by that pick. Reyes and Martin doesn't go the distance at minus 155. Rocco Martin, I really thought was going to have a killer instinct here and put a stamp on because the fight played out a lot like I said. Reyes had a shot at a rear naked choke earlier on in the evening, but he got the back right at the last second of the round that he really didn't have any time to do with it. So that was a bit of a bummer because he would have been dangerous having Rocco's back. And Rocco in the third round, he could have just kept chipping at Marias's leg and just caved him in. That would have been an easy path to victory and an easy way to really just express his dominance over his opponent by forcing him to collapse under the weight of a leg that couldn't hold him up anymore. People have been TKO'd like that by leg kick, and I really think that he could have done that, but he decided to coast to a victory. So that was an unfortunate way that fight played out. I really think we could have cashed that one as well. Looking at our 4-dog play on the main card, really, I just should have stuck to my guns because that was a solid strategy. The problem here is, in a vacuum, Tim Boetsch was a bad pick. It was obvious that he was checked out. It was obvious that he is looking to retire. And I'll be frank with you, I did not hear the retirement comments before I made my pick. I didn't hear him talking about retirement, and if I had, we would have stayed completely off of that fight. Here's a tip for everybody. If a fighter is thinking about retiring, that means they're already mentally checked out. That hunger, that drive, that burn that keeps them going in the cage is no longer there. If it was, they wouldn't be talking about retiring. So if we had had that information, we would have steered clear of Tim Boetsch. Now, in this 4-dog play, it still worked, though, because, again, we were just trying to hit 2 of the 4. We understood that we only wanted to hit 2 of the 4. So that still would have been okay in this circumstance. We got absolutely robbed with Big Ben Rothwell. This is my one problem for the evening. Rothwell didn't win that fight? Are you kidding me? Rothwell absolutely won that fight. Oh my gosh, this drove me nuts. He lost a unanimous decision when he was so completely obviously the winner. Let me clue you in on how MMA is judged. Effective striking, grappling, effective aggressiveness, and octagon control. Rothwell outstruck Ivanov by a large margin in that fight. There was no grappling, so you can't grade that. He was the aggressor. He was constantly the guy stalking forward. Ivanov was on his bike the entire time. And then octagon control, Big Ben was in the middle of the cage, constantly forcing Ivanov back. What were you looking at? What the heck was going on? I do not understand how we lost that fight. That's my big pet peeve for UFC Wichita. Rothwell won. We got robbed. Long story short, we should have had the 2 out of the 4 that we were looking for. Nico Price comes through as an underdog at plus 260 inside the distance. Absolutely a war. That was the most fun fight on the card for anybody to watch. And then Derek Lewis, you know what? News comes out after the fight that apparently he had a torn MCL, ACL. He was dealing with some knee issues. And I got to tell you, even with those knee issues, we got absolute value on our plus 225. The issue for me here with this fight was that I criminally underrated Junior Dos Santos. I thought that Junior Dos Santos was further gone than he is, and I'm going to have to reassess the way that I grade him moving forward, because I think that was our big downfall here. Junior Dos Santos looked amazing. I want to take nothing away from him. And Lewis had plenty of opportunities and plenty of big shots that had Junior been as gone as I thought he would have, Lewis would have cracked him and dropped him, even with the health issues that he was dealing with. So, unfortunately, we go 1-7. I'm going to say that Otto and Boetsch were bad picks for the night. If we had steered clear of those 2, we could have saved a couple of units. But remember when I talked about how we're trying to go 55% on our picks? This is where variance comes into play, and variance is a new term for some of you, so I want to take just a second to explain it. You remember a couple fights ago when we bet Thiago Alves by decision at plus 375, and he won a split decision over Max Griffin? That's a perfect example of variance going our way. If one of those judges scores for Max Griffin instead, it's still a split decision, but it's a split decision loss, and we miss out on those 3.75 units. That is a perfect example of variance. Sometimes the judges are going to judge incorrectly in your favor, and sometimes they're going to judge incorrectly against you. As upset as I am, as clear of a winner as Ben Rothwell was or should have been, that's an example of variance going against us. Luis Smolka just not showing up, that's an example of variance going against us. That's something that we never could have capped or understood or saw coming unless you caught him in an interview looking really down, and he didn't. In all the pre-fight interviews, he looked completely motivated and ready to go. Marion Renault not putting her opponent on the ground after breaking her nose and beating her into the mat. That's variance going against you. She easily could have done that, but she didn't, you know? So these are just the kind of things that we have to keep in mind. Variance is a real thing. We had a lot of variance go against us, and we made 2 really bad picks at UFC Wichita, so we will try to correct those errors, and that's enough sermonizing. You get the idea. I'm hungry. I'm ready to get those units back. Let's move on to UFC London. Kicking the night off, we've got a featherweight matchup between newcomer Mike Grundy and Nad Narimani. Mike Grundy is 11-1-0, and Nad is 12-2-0. Mike Grundy is a bit of a hype job at the moment. If you guys have been on Twitter at all regarding MMA, absolutely everybody is smashing this guy, and I absolutely understand why. So our first pick of the night is actually gonna be Mike Grundy. While both of these fighters have impressive records, Nad has only had 2 fights in the octagon. He won both of those by decision. So only 2 UFC fights. That's not a whole lot to go off of. His opponent and UFC newcomer Mike Grundy, making his MMA debut, is 11-1, and he opened up as a massive underdog. Mike Grundy opened up at plus 200 in this fight. Now 71% of the money has come in on Grundy, knocking him all the way down to plus 130. We can get him at plus 130 at Pinnacle right now, and I think we're going to lock him up at that value. Even though the majority of the value is gone, if you got him at plus 200 or something like that, you got an insane amount of value on this kid. I'll keep it simple in this case so we can move right along. Grundy is the better wrestler. That's all this comes down to. Grundy is absolutely the better credentialed wrestler. These two are going to have a fight. It's going to be mostly a low-level striking match and then a grappling match. And with Mike being the better of the two, I expect him to get on top control and ride out a 3-round decision to win his UFC debut. Maybe he locks in a late submission or something like that, but we do not know enough about him to be able to make that kind of a judgment. Let's just take the small underdog price at plus 130, lock him up, and hope for a win in the first fight of the night. The next fight that we are actually interested in is Tom Breeze versus Ian Heinisch. Tom Breeze is 11-1-0. Ian the Hurricane is 12-1-0. This is another situation where I believe we've got value on a small underdog. I tweeted out earlier Ian Heinisch on my Twitter to make sure people got on him at a good price because I really think he's going to win this fight. So one more reason for y'all to be following me on Twitter, at DieHardMMAPod on Twitter. I actually am on Instagram as well. I like to make funny MMA memes, so give me a follow over there, why don't you? Heinisch is actually going to be the more physical of these two fighters. Tom Breeze, I think, is actually moving up a weight division to try and take on Heinisch. Heinisch is a natural 185er, and I have got to stop saying Heinisch. It's Heinisch, I think. I'm just going to call him Ian from now on, okay? I promise I'm not going to keep calling him Heinisch, because that's kind of cringy to keep hearing over and over again. Tom Breeze is 11-1-0. He's actually got a really balanced out record here. He's got 4 TKOs, he's got 6 submissions, and only 1 decision. His only loss came by decision against Sean Strickland in 2016. This is a real interesting double up-and-comer kind of fight. However, Ian, on the other hand, in my opinion, is just going to be the larger, more physical fighter of the two. Whenever people move up a weight class, we do see them tend to see some benefits, especially when it's early in their career. In a case like with Tom Breeze, he's only 27 years old, so he's still growing into his frame. He's probably learning that he's been sucking himself a little dry, cutting all that weight to get down to 170. So I expect him to look a little bit better at 185 than he does at 170, as opposed to an aging fighter who moves up in a weight class later in their career to try and find some kind of success. Ian is just going to be the more physical guy, and that's why I like him here. His entire game plan revolves around controlling his opponent and then beating them into oblivion. He's got a 3-round decision win against Cesar Ferreira in his first UFC official fight. He won his Dana White Contender Series by KO in the first round, and Cesar Ferreira is no joke. Let me tell you, if you start off your career in the UFC facing Cesar Ferreira, you're going places. Ian has a massive, massive ceiling. He's not even come into his own as a fighter. He's got a whole lot of room to improve in the area of his striking, but his grappling is already top-notch. He's a very good wrestler. He knows how to control his opponent's body, and when he gets on top of you, he just kind of keeps you in these awkward positions where he can land and you can't. And I really think he's just going to outmuscle Tom Breeze, especially getting an underdog price. I love the Hurricane here. So pick number 2 on the night. We're going to take Ian the Hurricane. We can get him at Pinnacle at plus 125. Let's roll with the dogs one more time here on the undercard. The next fight I want to talk about is a lightweight tilt between Mark Diakiese and Joseph Duffy. Man, I am excited for this fight. This one is really, really interesting for a couple of different reasons. Mark Diakiese, 12-3-0. His only 3 losses are actually his last 3 fights. He's having a hard time in the UFC right now. Joseph Duffy is 16-3-0 with 3 losses on his record as well, 2 of those coming in the UFC, but a decent bit more spaced out than Diakiese's. Duffy is a decently well-rounded fighter, and he has a solid submission game. However, he does have a hard time with takedowns. 10 of his wins have come by submission. However, he's only been in the UFC for about 6 fights. He's won 2 of those by submission. So even at the top level, he's showing that he's competitive when it comes to the ground game. Mark Diakiese, He's an incredible striker who is a little bit slower than I would like to normally see in this kind of a case. But what he does really well is he controls the pace of the fight and he controls the cage. On the feet, Mark Diakiese is definitely going to have an edge over Joseph Duffy. And if this fight happens to go to the ground, Joseph Duffy is going to have the submission advantage. However, Mark Diakiese does a really good job of keeping the fight standing and keeping it where he wants it to be. Joe Duffy doesn't have an incredible takedown game. I do not see him being able to get Diakiese to the ground. And if he can't get Diakiese to the ground, Diakiese is going to rough him up on the feet for the entire course of the fight. I actually think this line should be a lot closer. I know a lot of people are really high on Joe Duffy, but I'm not sold. We can get Diakiese right now at plus 170 over on Bovada. If you don't use Bovada, there's plus 167 at BetOnline. Something that we want to keep in mind that we really need to discuss in this case is that Diakiese's back is up against the wall. He's on a 3-fight losing streak, and usually that means death in the UFC. If you lose 3 in a row, you're generally cut from the promotion. But he's had exciting enough fights, and he's done well enough in his fights. They're giving him one more opportunity. They're giving him one last shot, and they're throwing him an opponent who is similarly matched against him. He's not going to get blown out here. They're giving him a guy who he can beat to try and keep him around in the UFC. He lost to Drakkar Klose by split decision. He lost by submission to Dan Hooker, and he lost by decision to Nasrat Haqparast. And if you recognize those 3 names, you know just how dangerous all 3 of those guys are, especially the last 2. A split decision loss to Drakkar Klose is a forgivable loss for a young fighter. Dan Hooker and Nasrat, those are legit losses. Those are 2 of the names that people put on the short list for being title contenders in the UFC's lightweight division. So you really can't blame this kid for losing to them, especially losing to Nasrat by decision and not by finish. Getting submitted by Dan Hooker submits everybody. There's nothing wrong with that. I really think that because Diakiese's on a 3-fight losing streak, we are getting some line value and he is being underrated here against Joe Duffy. I think he understands that his career and his job are on the line in this fight. He is going to fight harder. He is going to fight smarter, and he is really going to be desperate out there in this matchup. And that's something that you have a hard time adding a numerical value to. But I think it's going to add some extra effort and some extra value in this fight that people may not be considering. So let's take our third dog for the night. Let's lock up Mark Diakiese at plus 170. Kicking off the main card on ESPN Plus, we're going to take a look at Jack Marshman facing John Phillips. Jack the Hammer Marshman is 22-8, and he is the favorite in this fight. Jack Marshman opened up as a minus 185 favorite. He's currently sitting around minus 155 over on 5 times. And John Phillips opened up as plus 145 as an underdog. And that's dropped just a little bit to right around plus 140, plus 135. So not a whole lot of movement there on that one. But what I think is happening is that we've got a really solid value opportunity here with Jack the Hammer Marshman. 66% of the money has come in on John Phillips, and he's only dropped about 5 or 10 cents on the betting line. That's kind of odd. You would think that that drop would be a lot steeper if 66% of the money was really coming in hard on somebody like that, but it hasn't. It just hasn't moved all that much. And what that tells me is we have almost a reverse line movement situation in this kind of a case. Get back to me in the comments, tweet at me, let me know. I think I need like a sound effect or something to warn you guys when we've got a reverse line movement situation, because those are spots that I really like to pay attention to. With only 34% of the money coming in on Marshman, he's dropped from minus 185 all the way down to minus 155, about a 30-cent move, and I think we got to snatch that up. He is just the more battle-tested and veteran of these 2 fighters. You may look at his record and see 4 KO losses and think, oh man, John Phillips, he's flawed, but he's got some power. That could cause a problem. Well, take a look at Marshman's record. He got KO'd clean by Thiago Santos in 2017. Remember Thiago Santos. He's probably going to be the next guy to face John Jones up at 205. He's been on an absolute murder spree in the UFC. There is no shame in getting knocked out by Thiago Santos, because if you line up the who's who of the UFC 185-pound division, he'll drop them all. So no shame in that. Prior to that, his last knockout loss was all the way back in 2014 before he ever got into the UFC and went on the run that really got him noticed. So I'm not worried about his chin. I'm not worried about the power. That's something people keep talking about, is that he might be chinny or susceptible to the knockout. I just don't see it based on his record. Now, he did lose a decision to Carl Robertson. That's not great. It's not terrible. And he got submitted by ACJ, Antonio Carlos Jr. That's another one that we can really just draw a line through. Everybody gets submitted by ACJ. His ground game is phenomenal. Now, John Phillips has no ground game. So when they match up here, that weakness is not going to be a problem. All he's got to watch out for is John Phillips' hands. And based on his fights so far in the UFC, he's proven that he can do that, except the time he got caught by the one and only Thiago Santos. The ground game deficiency for John Phillips, however, could be a problem. If Jack Marshman happens to be the one to take this fight to the ground, he's been submitted 5 times, and he has not been in the UFC for all but 2 fights. Now, 2 of those fights were by submission in the UFC, and let me tell you, John Phillips got wrecked by Charles Byrd and by Kevin Holland. He was absolutely dominated by both of them. And Charles Byrd, as we discussed, I think in the last UFC fight, or the one before that, he's just not that spectacular of an opponent. In fact, I think we bet against him and we were right. I feel like we just won a bet against Charles Byrd. And I don't think that he's necessarily UFC caliber. So if you look at Jack Marshman and just strength of schedule here, he beat Magnus Eatonblad, he beat Ryan James. Those are middle to low tier UFC fighters. He lost to Anthony Carlos Jr. and Thiago Santos. Those are high to top tier UFC fighters. So if we just want to grade him on that 2-2 scale, he is somewhere in the middle of the road, maybe more near to the top of the middle of the road, whereas Jack Marshman steps into the UFC, gets 2 fights, gets wrecked in both by non-top level caliber opponents. I think we're getting a steal here with Jack Marshman after people have been counting on that power for John Phillips, because that's all he's got in this fight. We're going to lay the minus 155 at 5 dimes and actually take a favorite here. Jack Marshman, minus 155. And I'll be honest, I wouldn't hate it inside the distance either. The props are not out at the time of recording this podcast, but if you wanted to take Jack Marshman inside the distance, I think there might be some extra value there. He might see the hole in Phillips' game and get it to the ground for the first time in his UFC career and actually sub somebody, because we've seen that Phillips just can't hang on the ground. So I'm going to play him straight in this case, but if you want that little extra sprinkle, I wouldn't hate Marshman inside the distance for you. Next up, we've got Danny Hot Chocolate Roberts, 16-3-0 against Claudio Silva, who is 12-1-0. Claudio Silva is a little bit older. He's 36 years old at this point, and this fight is taking place at 170 pounds. Danny Hot Chocolate Roberts, I just love that name, by the way. I'm going to say it a lot, Hot Chocolate. It's great. He's 31, and he's kind of a KO or bust kind of fighter. You go back to 2016, he fought Mike Perry and got KO'd late in the 3rd round, and he won TKO over Bobby Nash. He got KO'd by Nordine Taleb, and then he rebounded with a KO over Oliver Enkamp. It's just kind of what he does. He's a very, very live and die by the sword type of fighter. And this is another striker versus grappler type of matchup. This whole card really just seems to be striker versus grappler until you get to the very tip top of it. Claudio Henrique Hannibal de Silva. What a mouthful for that guy. Let's just call him Silva. Claudio Silva has a phenomenal ground game. He's got 7 submissions. He's got 2 KO, TKOs, and 3 decisions on his career. And he only has 1 loss, and it was by DQ. So technically speaking, this guy's undefeated. He should be 13-0. Now, in this fight, I'm not overly impressed with Danny Hot Chocolate Roberts. He just seems to be a middle-of-the-road type of power striker, and he really just leans on that knockout power. He did win a split decision against David Zawada in his last fight, but David isn't really an impressive fighter either. I think Claudio's going to come out here and get this fight to the ground as early and as often as he can, and he's either going to ride Danny Roberts until he's too tired to land that knockout punch, or he's going to submit him. That's just how this fight is going to go. I'm all over Claudio Silva here. I'm going to side with the grappler in this particular case, and we can get him sitting at about minus 145. Let's go ahead and lock him up. Minus 145 five dimes. We've been having a lot of these striker versus grappler type of matchups, especially on this particular card. And just a little peek behind the curtain here, as far as my handicapping goes, I tend to side with the grapplers in these cases. When you've got two guys who are going to strike, I usually side with the guy who's got the power bomb KO opportunity. But when it comes to a grappler versus a striker, as opposed to a striker versus a striker, I tend to side with the grappler, simply because you have a lot less opportunities to land the fight-winning bomb if you're on your back. Now, when you're with another striker, you've got a full 15 minutes. You've got a full 25 minutes to go ahead and land that one power shot that's going to win you the fight. And in my opinion, that makes it far more worth it to chase the KO opportunity with the fighter, especially if you're getting an underdog price on them. Now, when they're fighting a grappler, however, they're going to spend a lot more time making sure that they stay at a range where the striker isn't able to hit them. If they put them on the ground, that's more seconds ticking away that they're not on their feet trying to strike. And even if there's some cage grappling where they're pressed up against the cage, you've got to use elbows or knees. And if you don't have those tools in your toolbox, you're just narrowing the scope of victory, just smaller and smaller and smaller as those seconds tick away in the fight. So that's why I like taking the grappler in these type of situations. Danny uses his hands mostly, and by using your hands mostly, Silva is going to limit the amount of time that he has to use those hands in this fight, which I think leads to a better decision opportunity for us. Back on track with UFC London, I just want to take a little bit of a notice here. Nathaniel Wood, 15-3-0, is fighting Jose Alberto Quinones, who is 7-2-0. Wood is the biggest favorite on the card. He opened up at -260, and he's been bet all the way up to -325. Holy cow. And this is one of those alert reverse line movement type of situations. 54% of the money has come in on Quinones, and he's gone from a +180 underdog all the way up to a +265 underdog. Wood is a massive, massive heavy favorite, and if you got him early, you probably got some value on that favorite line, but at this point, it's been basically beaten to hell. If you want to play Wood, I think he probably gets this fight done inside the distance. You might look for a prop like that when it does come out. I can't give that as official pick, simply because those props are not out at this time. The other thing you might want to look at doing with him is you could probably parlay him. There are a couple decent sized favorites on this card that are between -200 and -300 that you could pair him up nicely with. Try and get him down to around even money, but basically because of where the line is at this point, this fight is just a pass. Now we're getting into the real meat and potatoes of the card here. We've got a light heavyweight fight between Volkan No Time Ozdemir and Dominic Reyes. I am so excited for this fight. Dominic Reyes was my UFC light heavyweight to watch before Johnny Walker stepped into the cage, flexed his abs, and started taking people's heads off. Johnny Walker is my new favorite 205-pound fighter, but just before that, Dominic Reyes was my favorite 205-pound fighter. Now, his fight name is The Devastator, and let me tell you just how appropriate that is. Dominic Reyes is 10-0 with 6 KO victories, 2 submissions, and only 2 decisions. Now, between you and I, that should be 7 KOs and 1 decision. His last fight against OSP, Ovince SaintPreux, went the full 3-round distance, but at the end of the fight, Dominic Reyes dropped a bomb on OSP and put him out clean. The referee didn't stop the fight before the final bell went off, but that should read KO at 4 minutes and 59 seconds of the 3rd round, because that's actually what happened. Now, they actually have a common opponent here. Volkan Ozdemir is 15-3-0, with his 2 last fights being 2 of his 3 losses. He lost to Daniel Cormier by KO, and then he got submitted by Anthony Smith. Now, that's a high level of competition for those 2 fighters. Anthony Smith is the most recent title challenger for John Jones, and Daniel Cormier is the GOAT, the greatest of all time, and the current heavyweight champion. Prior to that, though, Volkan Ozdemir had KO'd Misha Cirkunov and Jimmy Manuwa both in the 1st round. It only took him 28 seconds to KO Misha Cirkunov, and it only took him 42 seconds to KO Jimmy Manuwa. Now, both of those guys have very questionable chins. Prior to beating the 2 of them, his UFC debut was OSP, Ovince SaintPreux, and that's the connector between these 2 fights here. He won a close split decision over OSP, and that's where you can really see the difference between these 2 guys. OSP is a respectable opponent. Dominic basically beat him from pillar to post and then dropped a hammer on him to end the fight. Volkan Oezdemir squeaked on by him. Both of these fighters are strikers, and both of them are basically KO or bust. We are in for one hell of a fight between these two on Saturday night, and I cannot wait to see what happens. Dominic Reyes is notably a large favorite in this fight. He opened up at minus 245, and now he's sitting about minus 265. And I think that's about right. Now, Volkan Oezdemir, if you want to take a shot on somebody landing a big KO for the win, Volkan Oezdemir is your guy to do it. He's done that to several people before, and that's how he got the nickname No Time. And at plus 225, I can see taking a poke there, and generally you would think that that would be the way that I would go. But he has shown a lack of striking defense. Dominic Reyes' striking game is just all around better than Volkan's. He's got striking power to match Volkan Oezdemir, but he takes his time a lot more. He controls the pace a lot more. I expect him to be a bit more of a ghost. I think Volkan Oezdemir is going to swing and miss more against Dominic Reyes than the other way around. With Dominic doing his thing, Volkan Oezdemir swinging and missing, I think as soon as there's a chink in the armor, as soon as Volkan Oezdemir slows down just a hair, Dominic is going to come in and put one of those hammers on his chin and call it a night. Again, there are no KO props at this point, but I would take Dominic the Devastator by KO if I could get it. I also think that Dominic is going to be a worthy parlay piece because I see him as the absolute winner in this fight, and he's probably going to be challenging for a title pretty soon, or he'll be fighting against Johnny Walker in a number one contender type of matchup because he's just that good. What we're going to do with him is we're actually going to go ahead and parlay Dominic Reyes with another favorite on this card, but with only 2 fights left, you might be able to guess which one it's going to be, but let's save it here for just a minute. We'll keep you in suspense for just a bit longer. The co-main event of the evening is Leon Edwards 16-3-0 versus Gunnar Nelson 17-3-1. This welterweight fight is another nice fight for the hardcore type of fans. Both of these guys are on the rise in the welterweight division. Both of them have had a couple of setbacks, but man, are these guys good. Gunnar Nelson actually just released probably one of the funniest pre-fight hype workout videos. He's got a singlet on and a bunch of other people that are dressed all weird, and there's some massive hip thrusting going on, so take a look around Twitter or YouTube for that one because it's a treat. One more time for this podcast, I'm going to say the term striker versus grappler. This is exactly what this is. Gunnar Nelson comes from a karate background. He's got a really rigid, explosive type of striking where he'll sit really still, he'll kind of lull you a little bit, and then he explodes and he strikes, kind of like Lyoto Machida. Now, he doesn't actually strike like Lyoto Machida, but it's a similar style of fighting. Leon Edwards is an all-around striker. Gunnar Nelson's ground game is beyond legit. However, we're going to take the flip side of this coin, and we're actually going to side with the striker in this particular matchup. Gunnar Nelson leaves massive holes in his stand-up game. He is slow and plodding, and he just does not have a whole lot of output on the feet. And even when he does strike, he's not dangerous on the feet. His striking is basically used to get you within grappling range so that he can then take you down and grapple you. I just don't think that's going to work against Leon Edwards. Edwards is an impressive 16-3-0, and his last loss was a decision loss against Kamaru Usman, who's the current champion and just took out Tyrone Woodley. Since he dropped that fight to Usman, he's gone 6-0, with his most recent win being over Donald Cowboy Cerrone. And you all know Donald Cowboy Cerrone. You know the kind of tear that he is on. So getting a win over Cerrone in 2018, that really to me speaks volumes of just the kind of opponent that this guy can hang with on the feet. So Leon Edwards is not going to want to grapple. Gunnar Nelson is not going to want to strike. And I expect Edwards to be able to have the kind of takedown defense it takes to keep Gunnar standing on the feet. If Gunnar slows down a little bit and he gasses, I really can see Leon Edwards finishing this fight. That's not to say that I'll rule out him winning by decision, because he definitely can. But I really think that there's an opportunity here for him to turn it up just a notch more than we're used to seeing him crank up his offensive output and really show that he belongs on the short list of title contenders at 170 pounds. This fight is very close. I don't want to say it's a title eliminator because it's definitely not. Neither of these guys are really knocking on the door for a title shot, but the winner of this fight will be considered. A winner of this fight is going to be in that little group of people that they're going, you know what? That might be the next guy. And I think that this is another wonderful opportunity where a lot of people have really come in hard on Gunnar Nelson. 59% of the money has flowed in on Nelson, knocking him from a plus 125 favorite all the way down to a minus 103 at Bookmaker. It's pretty much a pick'em over there. We can get the favorite, Leon Edwards, at minus 125 over at 5 Dimes. And I think that we are getting phenomenal value paying that shorter price on the favorite because I think he legitimately is the favorite in this fight. Let's roll with Leon Edwards at minus 125. Finally, for your main event of the evening, we've got Darren Till facing Jorge Masvidal again in the welterweight division. This fight is so interesting on a bunch of different levels. Jorge Gamebred Masvidal is only 34 years old. Now, in fight life, he is so much older than that. He's 32 and 13. And if you go all the way back to like the Kimbo Slice YouTube background brawl type of fights, he's in a lot of those videos. He was there with Kimbo doing these backyard fighting bare knuckle type of situations. And now he's been in the UFC basically forever. His last couple of fights, he's hit a bit of a rough patch. He did beat Ross Pearson, Jake Ellenberger. He TKO'd Donald Cerrone in 2017, which really, I gotta tell you, my fading of Donald Cerrone and losing money trying to go against Donald Cerrone, I blame Jorge Masvidal because that was the fight. I bet on Jorge Masvidal against Donald Cerrone, and he KO'd the crap out of Cerrone. And I was just like, you know what, that's it. Cerrone's old, he's done, it's over. And I've been fading him ever since, and you know what? He's basically kicked my ass. So thank you, Jorge Masvidal. I blame you. After beating Donald Cerrone, he lost to Damian Maia via split decision, which again, that's another just pinpoint that Damian Maia is not the kind of guy that you take a split decision loss lightly to. The fact that they went to a split decision puts Jorge in that upper echelon because Damian Maia is that dangerous of a fighter. Jorge also lost a decision to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. That's one that I think we can take a little bit more value from because Stephen Thompson, his most recent opponent was Darren Till, and Darren Till came out on top in that matchup. So we've got a couple of circling options here as far as value and opinion and information goes. Darren Till is 17-1-1. His most recent loss was by submission to the former champion, Tyrone Woodley. Now, he got clipped in that fight by Tyrone and dropped. However, Tyrone was not able to put him out. He hurt him, and he was kind of pounding on him on the ground, but it was apparent that Darren Till was just so damn big that he wasn't going to be able to put him away with ground strikes convincingly enough to get the referee to step in and stop it. So he went for the choke, which really smart move on Tyrone Woodley's part, because I think Darren Till could have got back in that fight if he didn't make that move. Prior to losing to Woodley, Till had come across Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and Donald Cerrone. He KO'd Donald Cerrone stiff at the end of the first round, and then he beat Wonderboy Thompson in a 5-round, slow plotting type of boring fight. But he did beat a point fight against Wonderboy, and that's all Wonderboy does. He's a karate point fighter. So the fact that Till was able to stay on the feet with him and actually hurt him in that fight and then take a unanimous decision win, that says something about the caliber of striker that he is. Now, if you go back a little while on YouTube, search for Robin Black. I want to say it's called Like Water. He really breaks down Jorge Masvidal and the way that this guy strikes. And he uses the Bruce Leroy be like water analogy a lot in it. It's a super interesting listen because Masvidal is just that special of a striker. He really gets into the cage and goes with the flow, and he's just so good at so many different things that you can never really pin down exactly what he's going to do. However, I think that's almost a negative in some points. He gets into a flow, he gets into a rhythm, and he stops thinking. He's not the kind of guy who's out there after the title. He's not the guy who's out there to prove that he's the best in the world. He's a fighter's fighter. He loves to fight. Yes, he will pick people apart. Yes, he's got a mean streak in him and he will hurt people. But he's also out there just for a good time. So I think he can get lulled into a fight and really just not give us much of anything. He's got a lot of split decision losses on his record simply because of that. Where I think if he wanted to kick it up into third gear, he could have, and he could have won some of these fights, but he was just enjoying himself or didn't care enough to make that happen. Now, maybe towards the tail end of his career, he's pulling a Cerrone on us and he's going to turn that around and change it, but I don't know that this is the fight that he can really do that. Neither of these fighters are looking to take this to the ground. I would say that Masvidal's got a decent ground advantage over Till. I don't know if he's got the wrestling chops to take Till down to utilize that ground advantage. Either way, he's not even going to be looking for the takedown. He's just not that kind of guy. He's only got 2 submission victories because he doesn't want to play it smart. He doesn't want to play it safe. He wants to get in there and throw down and see who's left standing. That's the kind of guy he is. And that's just a terrible, terrible strategy going up against the bigger, stronger fighter in Darren Till. Darren Till is cutting down and killing himself to get to 170 pounds. There will come a day that he won't be able to make that anymore. He belongs at 185. Jorge Masvidal belongs at 155. That's where the majority of his career took place. And he finally moved up to 170 and had a little bit of success against guys like Ross Pearson, a faded Jake Ellenberger, and Donald Cerrone, who also is a natural 155er. Now he gets up here with the big boys, Damian Maia, Stephen Thompson, and he loses those fights. You're going to put him in a fight where the size difference is massive. Now in MMA, size isn't everything. All right, if you've got the technique to overcome the size discrepancy, you're good to go. But in this particular case, they're both excellent strikers, and I don't know that Gamebred is a better enough striker to overcome the size difference. Darren Till should be a weight class up. Jorge should be a weight class down. With them meeting in the middle, Till is going to be so much bigger and stronger, and he's going to have a height and reach advantage. I think it's just a matter of time before he clips Gamebred good. Now, Masvidal's only been knocked out one time in his career. At least that's what his record says. It was an early stoppage very early on in his career, and it was an early stoppage. It really wasn't a knockout. So technically speaking, he does have 13 losses. We can put a line through one of those, give him 12 losses, and he's never been knocked out in his professional MMA career. I don't know that Darren Till is going to be the guy to pull that knockout. I was super excited to come on here and get a real big, juicy underdog line taking Darren Till by decision, because going a full 5-round fight with Darren Till, usually he shuts the lights off on somebody before that ever happens. But he went to a 5-round decision with Stephen Thompson because he respected the striking prowess of Stephen Thompson, and that's the kind of fight that Thompson likes. I can see that happening here against Masvidal. I can see them both respecting one another and trying to avoid the damage and having a very tactical type of fight. The other thing you got to remember is we're in Till's backyard. This is the O2 Arena. This is in London. The UFC has gone out of their way to promote the crap out of Till, making his return to his home ground. And every single time he lands just the slightest bit of a shot, the crowd is going to go nuts. Every time Jorge lands, it's going to be crickets. Now, believe it or not, that will affect the judges. If the judges hear people screaming when a punch lands, you think that's going to have an effect on them? Oh, absolutely. In their brain, it's going to click that, oh man, that was a solid hit. That was a good connection, when maybe it was a lighter touch. Till's hometown advantage is really going to come into play here, especially if this does go to decision. If it's a close fight, Till's going to get the nod. I guarantee it. So either Till wins this thing by KO because he's simply the bigger, stronger fighter, or they manage to get to the scorecards, and unless Masvidal just completely outclasses Darren Till, which I do not see happening, Till wins by decision. Till's the rightful favorite, and I honestly have no problem laying this price with him. I'll tell you this, there is line value on Jorge Masvidal. I know a lot of respectable bettors who are putting their money on Jorge Masvidal because he's a plus 195, plus 220 type of favorite right now, and that line is disrespectful of his skill set. But Darren Till wins this fight. We're going to go ahead and close that parlay that I mentioned earlier with Dom the Dominator Reyes and Darren Till. We've got minus 265 and minus 250. That's going to put us right around minus 108, minus 110. So almost even money. We're going to parlay those two fighters together to go ahead and close out our night and look for a solid bounce back from the horrific night that was UFC Wichita. So to recap, we've got picks, 5 of them. Grundy, plus 130. Ian the Hurricane Heinisch, plus 125. Mark Diakiese at plus 170. Marshman at minus 155. Take him inside the distance if you feel like it. And then we're going to parlay Darren Till with Dominic Reyes for minus 108 to close out the main event. I'm looking forward to a massive bounce back here tonight, guys. We're going to wipe away UFC Wichita. We're going to get those units back and get this thing back on track. Thank you all so much for tuning in once again to the Die Hard MMA podcast. As always, I love you all. Give me a follow at Die Hard MMA Pod on Twitter. Give me a follow at the Die Hard MMA podcast on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. Let's blow this thing up. Share, like, subscribe, comment, leave me a rating. Jump on iTunes. Help me out. Let's spread the word about this thing and let's make some money. I love you all one last time. Thank you for sticking with me through a really rough week, and let's roll.